Hi everyone, welcome or welcome back to Misinformation in Science and Society. Here to listen, not to judge. I'm your host Annie, and today with us we have Patrick Bloniasz, who is a PhD student in computational neuroscience as well as a personal trainer.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing well. So sorry about the mix up with the times and whatnot, but
You're good. Uh-huh. Um, so yeah, let's just get started. Could you please introduce yourself and like kind of what you do?
yeah, totally. So my name is Patrick Bloniasz. I am a PhD student in computational neuroscience. So that's sort of like the intersection of math and neuroscience, where we study the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as sort of like a second thing, I'm also a personal trainer. So I work with folks who come out of physical therapy. Um, so I very much enjoy both of them. I see a lot of connections between them, but yeah.
Fun. So why did you choose this like career initially?
Yeah, so I think, with the neuroscience, I've always really been interested in research and, asking big questions and then trying to, search them out. Like I remember in high school, I was really into journalism. Before that, I was really into like student government and things like that, where I could,
Mhm.
sort of argue for a particular policy or something at my school. And I think that continued to develop in my undergraduate career where, um, I would engage with lab research, engaged with educational research, just pretty much everything I can get my hands on. Um, I will say that what drew me to neuroscience was just like my interest in how people learn and how people communicate. And so I think, when I got to my undergraduate school, which was a little school called Bowdoin College in Maine, I got very interested in sort of like the processes underlying how we learn. So I started taking psychology classes, started taking biology classes, and it just kind of kept progressing from there. Um, and I think probably like 3 years into that, I was really thinking, hey, like this is kind of what I want to do. So, the next step after your undergrad in neuroscience is to go to, graduate school, which is what I'm doing, getting like a research assistant job or going to medical school. So I decided to go and get my PhD, and so I've been doing that.
Yeah. What's your like favorite part of doing what you do?
Yeah, I think so. There's a whole bunch of different um, components to my job. I think, as I was mentioning, one part of it is just doing, research. So you have to go to lab every day. You have to run experiments. Um, you have to read a lot. So read a lot of, information in journals. Read a lot of sometimes blogs of like what other scientists will write about
Mhm.
a particular topic. So I think like what's really exciting about that side of it is you get to first be really creative in how you design an experiment. How do you try to approach answering a particular question?
Mhm.
And then I think I really enjoy, um, you know, trying to piece together, the work of everyone else into like a coherent narrative.
Oh,
So it's a little bit like storytelling. It's a little bit like, puzzle solving. Um, so I do very much enjoy, that aspect of it. I think, it is pretty challenging in the sense that a lot of things you do don't work. So a lot of experiments fail.
mhm.
Um, sometimes funding might be an issue. So, you might not be able to try an experiment until you get like a particular grant or something along those lines. So I think there's definitely those exciting features and those drawbacks. But
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. So why do you think truth is so important and why do you think misinformation is such a big issue right now?
Yeah, so I could sort of like parse that um, apart. So I think, first, why is truth so important, at least in my field? Um, it's kind of like a cliche, but like truth is kind of like the currency of science. So when we are publishing our work, or we're communicating at a conference, or we're communicating outside of like the scientific community.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that's kind of what legitimizes the work, and why we even do it in the first place. We're searching after a truth in a particular area. Um, in my field, like we're really trying to understand the brain, not only at like a basic level where we're just saying like what is this thing and like how does it do what it does,
Mm-hmm.
um, but also overcoming um, you know, for example, certain diseases to increase the quality of life of individuals who are living with those diseases. So I think that, if you don't have truth in that particular area, it sort of, uh, defeats the purpose of like what we're going
Mm-hmm.
um, after. I think like more broadly in society, truth is really important because it's sort of like what creates trust, like in communities and across people. And so, I think if you want a society that is working for everyone, is like meeting people's needs, I think like you have to have that fundamental layer of trust.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the second part of your question, when you're talking about, misinformation, um, I can sort of answer that both in science and then more broadly, at least what I think. I think, in science, there's two, like, there's the classic distinction between misinformation and disinformation,
Mm-hmm.
where misinformation is sort of like the propagation of things that are like incorrect, but without like malicious intent. And like disinformation, is where someone like might create something or cherry pick a particular fact or something along those lines and propagate that for a particular end. Um, and so that's one distinction I'll make. The other distinction is between people who practice science and people who consume science. So people who practice science are still consumers themselves. So like I was mentioning earlier, I might run certain experiments and things along those lines, but I'm also reading the work of other people.
Mm-hmm.
With people who consume science, like they might not practice, they might not run experiments, etc., but they might read like what a journalist says about science or things along those lines. Um, so with misinformation, when you have a process that relies on interpreting the work of other people to inform your own, there's always going to be misinformation. So you might sort of, quote a paper, for example, but quote it incorrectly. And that happens actually very commonly. People have to read, hundreds of papers that are very long and very dense, very quickly. And so, people might only read certain parts of the paper. So
Oh.
they might read like the introduction, the conclusion, they might pick something from the methodology, but they'll take it out of context, and sort of miss like a line that might qualify it, many paragraphs later, many pages later. So I think like that is an example in science that's always existed and always will exist, just because we rely on each other for accurate information. Um, a more concerning form of like misinformation, at least in science, is, or at least my area of science, is like with health information. I think that a lot of folks who might do work with diet or supplements, like food supplements and things along those lines,
Mm-hmm.
um, will often make information more sensational than it perhaps is. I think like one inconvenient thing about science and how it's interacts with society is that science moves very slowly, doesn't jolt forward in our progress or our understanding, and very rarely does anything we do sort of like deserve the title of like breaking news, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when you sort of have to like report on those things, right? You need to sort of like communicate them in a way that makes them exciting to read or engaging to read. Try to tell a good story,
Oh.
um, and so I think like that is something that has increasingly gotten worse, just because the news cycle, for example, has a lot of pressure on it to always be novel, I guess. So, the 24-hour news cycle, there always needs to be something in like the health section. And so, I think like people will search for things that perhaps like aren't ready to be communicated or we don't really know that much about. Um, More broadly in society, to like finally answer the end of your question, I think like why is it so much of an issue now? Um, I personally am not convinced that it's more prevalent now than it used to be. You see, different phenomena with, um, for example, like like yellow journalism, where people were like basically like making up stories to get like sensational feedback from the public. Or before then, there was like little pockets of communities that would spend or spread mistruths.
Oh.
I think what's unique now is how it spreads through, for example, social media,
Mhm.
um, and also these echo chambers where people are only really seeing the content of their like particular network, or the sort of space on the internet that they're most known to like interact with. So when we have social media that have algorithms that are designed to sort of give you content that you're going to engage with, whether it's for positive reasons or negative reasons,
Mhm.
um, you know, people kind of get trapped in those circles. And so, anything that is really highly engaging but is false, either for malicious reasons or just because someone got it wrong, I think that spreads much quicker and it's much harder to break out of because that's all you're seeing. Rather than in the past, it wasn't quite so systematic in how um, that disinformation or misinformation might take a hold of someone.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Um, so could you talk a little bit more about misinformation in like your field and how do people like try to tackle or avoid it?
Yeah, so the going back to like misinformation among researchers, I think the gold standard right now is something called peer review. So when you publish a paper, or submit it to a journal rather, basically they'll have typically two or three independent scientists who aren't affiliated with the journal and don't know the author. They'll typically have to go through the paper very carefully and vet it. So they'll fact check, for example, their interpretation of certain citations they have in the introduction or conclusion.
Mhm.
They will thoroughly review and critique like the methodology that they use in the experiment. Sometimes they will rerun the data analysis if that's something they're able to do, to make sure like the calculations are correct.
Uh-huh.
And so I think in that case, um, it works sometimes pretty well, to sort of get the misinformation out of there.
Mhm.
One downside to that is it takes a lot of time to peer review a paper well, and most peer reviewers, in fact, pretty much all peer reviewers aren't paid. So they have to do it on top of like all of their other jobs that they're required to do.
Uh-huh.
And so um, because of that, oftentimes people might miss something just out of the pure fact that they don't have time to really do it, but they're trying to, do the best that they can anyway. So you do see, papers, sometimes pretty important papers that have a lot of mistakes in them. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily have like an impact on the greater society. Um, Sometimes it does. So sometimes in like a medical journal, for example, you'll see a miscalculation or a misinterpretation or something.
Mhm.
It has like a direct impact on, you know, the ability of like a drug, for example, to be brought to market, to start treating people, or um, it might say that a certain treatment is like more promising than it actually is. So in those cases, like that's definitely an issue. And so we should probably think about, how do we improve those
Mhm.
mechanisms. Um, I think, outside of, experimenters, propagating misinformation between each other. So, out in society and things along those lines. I think neuroscience is often, I think a lot of people will draw information and facts from neuroscience to make a point because it sounds like more convincing. So oftentimes you'll see like, oh, like neuroscientists say, and
Uh-huh.
then whatever the thing is. And usually, like my personal advice is like when you see that, like whatever they're about to say is probably wrong, because there's not like a lot of like consensus in general among neuroscientists for most things. So you probably like are wrong to like clump them together in that sense. Um, but also, oftentimes people will go and take certain types of evidence from neuroscience that are like particularly like visually pleasing,
Mm-hmm.
and um, they'll sort of let those stand alone without context to try to communicate a point. And so something I see a lot of um, is something called a functional magnetic resonance imaging scan, or fMRI. Those are like those really pretty colorful pictures of the brain, where someone goes into a scanner, you see the brain, and then all these different parts of the brain light up
Yeah.
when certain activity
Mm-hmm.
is propagated during like a behavior. Um, and so typically people will take that out of context because first, those like scans, for example, aren't a direct measure of brain activity. They're measuring oxygen in the brain. And so, that could be for any number of reasons, not necessarily because, for example, that like brain region is being activated for a
Uh-huh.
particular thing. The other thing is, oftentimes, um, you know, people misinterpret that certain brain regions like are integrated in really complex networks, and so even something that like apparently looks a particular way
Mm-hmm.
doesn't actually tell you that much about what's going on. And so, you know, in the present day, if you just sort of do a behavior and sort of see particular like brain regions light up, like that usually won't be enough to publish the paper.
Uh-huh.
Really have to do much more careful analysis with other techniques to cross-reference those things. Um, but the reason I'm bringing that up is, people will make really strong claims about, the difference between how people's brains work in like political parties or like across countries or across like languages, like all these different things
Mm-hmm.
that are not warranted at all by the evidence. And then people will just run with it and claim that whatever that thing is that they're trying to propagate is just settled.
Uh-huh.
Uh, so I think that's particularly troubling, like trying to uh, sort of use the complexity and um, the fact that neuroscience research is so difficult to understand for a lot of people to make a point because they know that a lot of people aren't going to be able to fact check it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's troubling.
Yeah, that's definitely really interesting. So what do you think will be like the best way to like eliminate or avoid or reduce misinformation, either on like just like in society in general, either on the receiver side or the I guess spreader side? I don't know.
Yeah. I think with the uh, uh, yeah, so I guess like it depends on the medium. So there is some really interesting research in social media, where if you tag um, related information that is like correct to posts that are incorrect, um, it's especially about neuroscience or science in general, it
Mm,
tends to correct the spread of misinformation. So you might have seen in the more political sphere, someone might tweet or like post a video or something, and there'll be like context at the bottom. So it might be like from Wikipedia, or it might be from like the like Mayo Clinic or something along those lines.
uh-huh.
Um, it turns out that tends to actually work pretty well. It doesn't work for everyone, but um, usually, people who are consuming information don't have like malicious intent in consuming their information to like reinforce their bias and stuff like that. And so they're just consuming what's in front of them. And
Mm,
so if you are able to consistently put good information in front of people, even if it's attached to bad information, it tends to be helpful to like communicate a point.
mm,
So I think like in the social media sphere, we need to think carefully about how those platforms operate, in the sense of like how do people interact and use their features. Um, so I think like that's one part of it, like attaching good information to bad information.
mm,
Um, but I think like on a more social level, thinking about like how do we decide like what is good information and bad information. Um, I think in some spheres, the advice where you would say, oh, like go and look at like a reputable source.
uh-huh.
So for example, like you might think of like the New York Times, or you might think of like a certain journal, like a science journal,
Mm,
um, things along those lines where they're reputable organizations that are thoroughly fact checked. Um, I think that is good advice for a lot of types of misinformation and disinformation.
mhm,
Um, but I think it has its limits, specifically in the health sciences. So you'll oftentimes see in the New York Times, for example, really detailed, um, pieces on, like health research. So whether it's about like diets or it's about a particular type of food or something along those lines. And the information in it might be like factually correct, but the interpretations that are drawn from it are like invalid or incorrect. And it's not because they're doing like disinformation maliciously, or they're not putting in thorough time to research the
mhm,
topic that they're writing about. It's just that it's so difficult, because there's so many different areas of expertise that person writing about it should like might need to have to accurately talk about a particular topic. And
uh-huh.
so, for example, on some of these like research papers, you'll have like 10 authors on it. So it might be people from like biology, chemistry, physics, math,
Mhm,
psychology, like all these different people collaborating, because
mhm,
each person has a bit of expertise that they're adding to the project. But usually you'll only have like one, two, or three journalists writing about something,
mhm,
and they usually have like similar backgrounds, and they might not have like the expertise to effectively communicate the thing that they're talking about,
mhm,
while still staying true to like the facts. And so um, the reason I'm bringing that up is, that advice of, find a reputable source doesn't always work. And so I think like, people should have like a healthy dose of like skepticism in, um, the things that they read, not in the sense that like anyone is like lying to them or being like malicious, but just, you might want to find like alternative sources that are saying something like that, or
mhm,
um, if you're about to post something or like retweet it or something like that, you might ask yourself like, have I read the article fully instead of just like looking at the headline?
mhm,
And do I like understand um, like what exactly the article is about? And I think like when I want to repost something or share something or send a link to someone, it's good for me to pause and be like, oh, like maybe I don't quite understand the point like this person's making, or the information that they're spreading, or something along those lines.
uh-huh.
Uh, so I think it's both those systematic things, like how social media platforms are designed, but also on the personal level, being careful about, yes, the sources of the information, but also making sure you understand the things that you're spreading in like the social sphere.
Mhm, yeah, for sure. Um, so I think that's all my questions about misinformation. So just for fun, do you have like a role model?
Yeah, I guess I might not have like like a single role model per se, but I think um, someone I've really found meaningful to me like is was actually just like it was a professor that I had in college, but he was just like a really kind individual. Like he loved gardening, had like a really lovely family, and
Mhm.
was very active in his community. And like so I think like all these different traits were things that I was like, oh, like that's so nice. I think like in science, like everyone's always talking about like the really formal sides
Mhm.
of work, and like you got to take your work seriously. And I think we do, but it's really important to like have that broader sense of like what is like a meaningful life, and how do you be an active part of your community. So I think like I really do like to draw on the experiences of just meaningful people in my own life. My parents, for example, I think are absolutely lovely people. So um, yeah, no single role model, but uh, definitely just love drawing from people's experiences around me.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, do you have any advice for people, especially like teens? It can be about like information or just like in general.
Yeah, I think it depends on where everyone is at, but I think like establishing a good sense of balance between uh, I think like your social life, like your studies, your like professional life, things like that, and um, just like recreation, I suppose. Like I don't know how to like phrase that correctly, but I think like balance is a very like underrated thing. So, I feel like sometimes people will have too much of one thing, and that sort of closes off options in all of the others. So,
Mhm.
oftentimes people will be like, oh, like if you aren't like working all the time, like you're going to sacrifice like your ability to like either get like this particular job or like go to
Mhm.
this particular college or like anything like that. But it's kind of the same in every field. Like you don't want to close yourself off from your friends by focusing too much on work. Like you don't want to like close off your creative projects or your hobbies. Like sort of like what you're doing is very cool with this YouTube channel. Um, so I think balance is definitely something I would say, and then also just like don't take yourself too seriously. I think like we're all out here doing whatever we think is cool at the like at a particular time, and um, you know sometimes people like might not have like the resources or ability to do like something that they're excited about, but
Mhm.
we're all just trying to go through and enjoy the day as much as possible. So I think those would probably be my two bets.
Yeah, I think it's really good. So, thank you so much for being here again, and yeah.
Yeah, no, it was super great to chat with you, and I appreciate the chance to talk.
Hmm.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
bye
Have a
bye.
great rest of your day. Bye.